Welcome to the Test Administrator Training for the WIDA Alternate Access for ELL's assessment. In addition to this video training, TAs will be required to complete a short quiz and registration. Both of these links are available through the Moodle site. We will have a brief overview of the WIDA Alternate Access test and participation determinations. We will cover who can administer the assessment, test logistics, and security. Most of the training will focus on how to administer the test. You will need the training booklet and handout in hand during this video. It is highly recommended that you do this training with a colleague in order to get the most out of the experience. These documents are available on the Moodle site. Please pause the training at this point and complete the pre-test on the front page of your handout. The pre-test asks you to mark true or false for about 15 statements regarding the test. Please restart when you have completed this task. This training and the contents within are intended solely for the training of test administrators in the state of Washington and may not be used for any other purpose. By viewing this training, you agree to not disclose any proprietary information contained within. This assessment was developed specifically for language learners with significant cognitive disabilities. Many aspects of the test, including the built-in prompt repetitions and varied levels of linguistic complexity, are intended to provide greater access to test items for this specific population. This test measures language proficiency in relation to the WIDA alternate proficiency levels and is based on the WIDA English Language Development Standards. The alternate access is offered in 4 grade bands. Kindergarten students in Washington take the grade band 1-2 test. Scoring options on the WIDA alternate access are not aligned to ELPA 21 scores. Students on the alternate access can score at the A1, A2, or A3 levels in all 4 domains. These levels are considered proficiency levels that lead up to the lowest proficiency possible on the regular WIDA test. Students on the alternate access test can score at levels P1 and P2 in all domains and P3 in writing. Although these levels look like replicas of the proficiency levels in the regular test, there is no correspondence between the two tests. A student who scores at the P2 level in the alternate access may not score at a similar level on the regular assessment. IEP teams determine the appropriate assessment path for a student from the available assessment options. For English language proficiency, the options are the ELPA 21, the ELPA 21 with accommodations, and the WIDA alternate access for ELLs. Guidance from OSPI is available in the resource library on the special education page of the website. As with other standardized tests, a test administrator must be a certificated teacher or other trained staff who is supervised by a certificated staff member. Volunteers may not be involved in the testing session. It is important for this assessment specifically that the TA or TAs are familiar with the student and the student's communication style and tools. OSPI recommends that specialists from the EL and special education departments collaborate on testing. That collaboration may be prior to or during the testing session, but both departments should be involved and knowledgeable about the process and expectations. The testing window for the WIDA alternate access will align with that for other ELP testing from January 28 to March 22. All materials will need to be returned by March 29. If you need additional materials, they can be ordered by your district test coordinator through eDirect. Any questions can be directed to your state coordinator at the email on the screen. If a school in your district did not pre-identify a student for the WIDA alternate access, then the district will not receive school-specific labels for that student. The district assessment coordinator will need to contact the state coordinator to have new labels created. Please consider all test materials secure. Materials can be copied for accessibility purposes, but may not be copied for any other reason. Any copies that are made must be securely destroyed per your district's processes. Each domain in the alternate access takes approximately 20 minutes for students who complete the entire test. For each testing session, you should have the listening, reading, and speaking test, the student response booklet, the TA script, and a number 2 pencil. The test administrator manual is linked on the website for your reference. The listening, reading, and speaking test is the booklet that the student will use for testing. The student response booklet contains the rubrics the TA uses to score the test and the writing test. This is the booklet that is scored and cannot be altered. The TA script is used throughout all domains. All student response booklets must have a label affixed in the area indicated on the front of the booklet. If a student was not pre-identified or for another reason does not have a student-specific label, then the student's booklet will need to have a yellow school or district-specific label affixed to the booklet. The demographic information must be filled out on the front and back pages for students whose book does not include a student-specific label. In addition to the demographics information, all tests should have the testing and disability information pages completed. These are pages 3 and 4 in the student response booklet. The disability categories on page 3 are not fully aligned to Washington's disability categories. Please visit the alternate ELP assessment page on the OSPI website to access a crosswalk of the WIDA and Washington disability categories. While students are required to test annually, there may be situations that don't allow a student to complete a test or test at all. The ABS code indicates that a student was not in attendance during the testing session. This would not be a code used for a student who caught a cold and missed 3 days of school. Rather, this indicates a long-term absence. The INV code would typically be used for a booklet that cannot go through the machine to be scored. Perhaps it was ripped, a student became ill, maybe someone scribbled on it. In this case, the TA will transfer the responses to a new booklet and mark the original booklet as INV. DEC is a code used when students refuse to test. SPD is the code used to indicate a domain exemption. OSPI offers guidance for IEP teams regarding domain exemptions. You can access this guidance on the ELP assessment page. This image shows an example page from the TA script. Each domain begins with a warm-up script, but this warm-up is only on the first item. QA is also on the left side, along with an associated graphic. The graphic is identical to what the student sees in their listening, reading, and speaking test booklet. On the right page, the prompt continues with QB and QC. These prompts are only offered if the student does not meet standard at the QA level. The Moving On box at the bottom of the page helps determine next steps for TAs as they move through testing. As with most standardized tests, the TA script contains material that is read aloud as well as directions that are not intended to be read aloud. The bold wording indicates what is read aloud, while the information not in bold is for the TA's information only. In order to avoid undue frustration or boredom, try to keep the test moving at a steady pace. It may be appropriate to take breaks between domains for many students. TAs should find some time to practice before administering the test. It is appropriate to offer the student non-evaluative, positive feedback. Please note that the recommended testing order is listening, reading, speaking, and writing. This is not a required order and can be changed if needed. Now we will begin the administration practice. Please make sure you have all the materials before moving on. You will need the training handout, the listening, reading, speaking test booklet, and the TA script for this practice. All of these are located on the Moodle site. This portion of the training is most effective with a colleague. The listening portion of the WIDA alternate access includes 9 tasks. Each task contains 3 cues. This domain typically takes about 20 minutes to administer, and scoring can be done by marking the point at which a student answers correctly, A, B, or C, marking incorrect or no response. In the listening portion of the test, each item has 3 cues. The item always begins with cue A. If the student answers correctly, the test moves on to the next item, skipping cue B and cue C completely. If the student does not initially respond correctly to cue A, then cue A is prompted again. If the student does not answer correctly or does not answer at all, move on to cue B and then cue C if needed. In the listening domain, a student has 4 opportunities to answer an item. The moving on box at the bottom of the page includes script language depending on the current item number and the student's response. The moving on box indicates that the listening portion of the test can be stopped after 3 consecutive incorrect or no response items. This image shows what this might look like. If a student answers the first item correctly, but then answers 2 incorrectly before another correct answer, the counting starts over on item 5 when the student answers another item incorrectly. In your handout, you will find the listening rubric. Please take a look at the key column. This column shows the expectation for each task. For example, for task 1, a student is expected to attend to the item. The TA script will say something like, "Look at these pictures." And if the student looks, then the student has met the expectation. This is different than other tasks where the student is expected to select a specific response. There are some unique features of this test. Please keep in mind that if a student responds to any cue, they cannot receive a no response mark on that item. Also, if a student indicates a wrong answer at some point and then at a subsequent cue indicates the correct answer, then only the student's correct answer is recorded. It is essential that scores are recorded as a student tests in order to follow the stopping guidance appropriately. Please keep in mind that the communication tools a student regularly uses should be used for testing. If a student typically communicates through eye gaze, please allow the student to respond with eye gaze. It may be necessary to cut apart or enlarge the pictures in the listening, reading, and speaking test to accommodate a student's communication needs. In the student's listening, reading, and speaking test booklet, the pictures are in color and the paper is larger than a letter-size sheet. The materials for this training were created on a letter-size paper and lack color to save money. You have the listening, reading, and speaking test booklet and the TA script. At this point, please pause the training video and work with your partner to administer the training test items in the listening test. Remember to repeat QA when appropriate and record your answers in the rubric you have in the handout as you go. Resume the training once you have completed the task. Below are some of the questions that Here are some of the questions that arise after completing the practice opportunities for this training. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to share them. A frequently asked questions document is available on the ELP assessment page of the OSPI website. Please check this document to see if your question has already been answered. If you still need clarity, send your question to Leslie Huff, ELP Assessment Coordinator. If you are completing this training in a group, feel free to compile your questions before you send them. Common questions we have had in the past on the listening section include those listed on this slide. So the first question, what if the student points to the coin or image on top instead of the one lined up with the other 2 answers? If a student points to the cue picture instead of the one lined up with other responses, that is an acceptable response. The second question, how can my students who use eye gaze take this test? If a student uses eye gaze, please adapt the listening, reading, and speaking test to accommodate their communication needs. The booklet can be cut apart, enlarged, or in other ways altered to facilitate communication. If you do copy the response options, please ensure all copies are treated as secure test materials and destroyed when they are no longer in use. If you cut the booklet apart, you will need to return the pieces in an envelope with the barcode on the outside. There is no need to reassemble the booklet once it is separated or cut apart. Are the scores for A, B, and C weighted? In the listening and reading test, TAs can mark A, B, or C as correct options. These options are weighted in the algorithm that determines proficiency. A student who scores correct at the A level on all items will have a higher score and proficiency level than a student who scores at the level C for all items. Now we will begin the reading practice. The response items for this test are also located in the listening, reading, speaking test booklet. The reading test is identical in format to the listening test, and scoring options are also the same. As with the listening test, QA for each item is repeated before moving on to QB and C. There is no repeat for QB or C. As with the listening portion, the moving on box contains both language to be stated during the test, as well as directions for moving on or stopping a test administration. The stopping guidance for the reading test is identical to that for the listening test. After 3 consecutive marks of incorrect or no response, the reading test must be ended. The reading test rubric, like that of the listening test, includes a key for TAs to use as a guide to determining correctness. The first item in the reading test requires only that the student attend. Subsequent tasks require specific responses. At this point, please pause the recording and administer the reading test with your colleague. Take note of any questions you have as you go. It is good practice to change roles if you had one colleague administering the test and one colleague taking the test during the listening section. Flip roles for this section. Some of the questions that often come up for the reading section include those listed on this slide. What if the student points to the correct letter, but not the one in a response box? If a student chooses the correct letter, no matter where it is on the page, the TA can mark that response as correct. How can my student with vision impairments view this test? If a student is visually impaired and needs response items to be enlarged to access them, the responses may be enlarged. Please treat all copies that are made as secure test materials. Does the student have to read the word aloud if the directions say, "Read this word"? No. On items that request the student read a word or phrase, the student is not required to read aloud. Only the student's response choice is scored. Let's move on to the speaking test. The speaking test has a different format from the listening and reading tests. The speaking test contains 2 parts. Part A is always presented, and Part B is presented up to a ceiling. The stopping guidance for the speaking test is different from the previous 2 tests, as the scoring options have changed. The language around tasks has also changed. Instead of cues, speaking items have questions. Each task contains 3 questions, and all questions are presented and repeated before moving on. The scoring options for speaking include meets, approaches, or no response. In speaking, Any response that does not meet the expectation should be marked as approaches. In the speaking test, students have 6 opportunities to respond to each task. With the change in language around speaking items, the stopping guidance language also changes. The stopping guidance for the speaking portion is 3 consecutive responses of approaches or no response. In the Test Administrator Manual and in the handout you have for this training, there is guidance around the expectations for the speaking section. Review this guidance before beginning administration of the speaking section. Here are 2 examples of the kind of guidance you can find around the speaking expectations. When the expectation calls for vocalization, any verbal response the student makes meets the expectation. For these items, a student who is unable to articulate words would still be able to score at the meet level. Cries and grunts are acceptable responses to items that require vocalization. Produce a word related to task items require that a student produce a word. There is no requirement at this level that a student give elaborate or extended responses. On this slide, you can see the new scoring options for the speaking section of the test. The options for this section include meet, which indicates that the student has responded in a way that meets or exceeds the task level expectations. The approaches score is the score a student would receive for responses that do not meet the expectation listed on the rubric. The no response and not administered options are the same as for previous language domains covered. If a student does not respond to any of the 6 response opportunities for an item, then mark no response. Only mark not administered for the items that the student did not reach during the test. This is only marked after the stopping guidance has been applied to the domain. The rubric is found in your handout for this training. You can see that the key column you used during the listening and reading test has morphed into an expectations column for the speaking test. As you look through the expectations, you will notice that vocalize is the expectation for both number 1 and number 4. At this time, please pause the training video and work with your partner to administer the speaking section. Remember in this section that all questions are repeated for a total of 6 response opportunities for each task. In the past, many TAs have asked about students who do not speak. If a student is able to perform early communication sounds but not form full words, administer the test. This test has test items designed for students in the pre-word formation stages of language development. If a student has a disability that does not allow them to speak, then consider how the student expresses themselves outside the test and explore the accommodations manual to see what accommodations and supports can be applied to support the student's access to this test. If no access to the test can be provided for a student whose disability interferes with their ability to access the domain, then explore the domain exemption guidance to see if the student would qualify for a domain exemption. Please note that this decision is in the hands of an IEP team, not the TA. What if the student only grunts or cries as a vocalization? How do I score that student? If the student vocalizes in any way on number 1 and or number 4, these would be marked as meets. On other tasks where the expectation is higher, a grunt or cry would not typically suffice, but they could score approaches. What if the student says the whole word when it asks only for a sound? When the expectation is that a student will produce an isolated sound, the student cannot meet the expectation by saying the entire word. This would be approaches, unless the student is able to isolate the sound at a subsequent prompt. What if my student is just guessing? As with any standardized test, a student can guess at any answer. If that answer or response is correct, they get the associated score. I know my student cannot make letter-based sounds. Do we have to continue testing through number 6? This is a scenario where it is important for the TA to allow the test to determine a student's stopping point. If a student is unable to make letter sounds, but she or he can vocalize, then it is likely that this student will score meets on both numbers 1 and 4. If the student does this, then the test would continue at least through number 7 in order to match the stopping guidance. How do I distinguish in scoring between a student who meets on the first question and one who meets after 5 attempts? Many TAs have expressed concern with how the speaking section is scored. There is no weight given to a correct response on the first prompt versus a correct response elicited on the last prompt of a task in the speaking section. In the listening and reading tasks, where students select a response, the responses are weighted depending on which prompt elicited the appropriate response. Since students in the speaking section are constructing their own response, the responses are not weighted. Students answering at the first or last prompts would both score meets. Now we will move on to the final language domain, writing. You will need the writing practice handout for this section of the training. The writing test contains 3 parts. The first 2, A and B, are administered up to a ceiling. The third part is only administered to students who score meets on 7 out of 8 tasks in Part A and B. In the writing test, items are presented in a way that allows the TA to model the task before the student responds. Items are not repeated in the writing section. Scoring on the writing test is similar to the speaking test scoring options. The item language for the writing test is similar to that for the speaking test. Each item is a task, and each task has 3 questions that simplify the language presented. As with other domains, once a student answers a task appropriately, the rest of the task is skipped and the next task is presented. If a student responds, but the response is insufficient to meet the expectation, the student receives a score of approaches unless the student responds at a higher level in a subsequent question on the same task. For the writing test, there is no repetition required. The test tasks are administered from start to finish until the student meets the expectation, and then you move to the next item. As you can see, Part A and Part B have 4 tasks each. Both of these parts of the writing test ask students to demonstrate the same skills with a different prompt. In order to enter Part C, the student will need to have scored meets on 7 of the tasks in Parts A and B. As with other language domains, in the writing domain, the stopping guidance is outlined in the moving on box. The test must be stopped when a student receives no response or approaches on 3 consecutive tasks. Unlike the other domains, the writing test is located in the student response booklet. The writing rubric is located on the testing pages, typically next to the visual stimulus for the item. You can see in the red circle the expect box, which outlines the level of performance you are looking for in the test task. The writing domain has specific expectations listed in the Test Administrator Manual and also available in the handout you've been using for this training. These explanations will help you more accurately score the writing section based on the output of students. Here are 2 examples of the explanations you see in the Test Administrator Manual. When the expectation on the rubric says intentional mark, you are looking for the student to mimic the model. Please note that the student does not need to write with a writing utensil but can use a finger, chopstick, or other implement that they are more accustomed to using. At the copy level, students use finger, writing instrument, or other tool to copy the model word. All or part of the word may be copied. There is no requirement at this level for students to produce original text. I will provide you with a few samples of student writing. Please look at the expect box for the item and choose the appropriate score. Let's begin. How would you score this response? Notice the expectation is to copy the word Savannah. This response would score approaches. This is clearly an intentional mark, but it is not a word. What about this response? How would you score this? This response can score approaches. The student made intentional marks, but not a discernible word. This could also be scored meets. The rationale here is that one of these marks resembles a V, that is part of the target word, Savannah. Here is the next one. How would you score this? This would typically score no response. However, it could score meets if the student is using a finger to demonstrate writing and the student's abilities warrant such a score. How would you score this? This response scores meets. This is an original word related to the map for the task. The spelling of building is incorrect, but the word is comprehensible. How would you score this one? The score for this would be approaches. This is the letter T, but it is not a word. This is our last one. How would you score this? This response may score approaches. If this is the word more, M-O-O-R, or more, M-O-R-E, there is no relation to the stimulus and it does not meet the expectation identified in the rubric. However, if this is the word store, it is related to the map in the task and would meet expectation. In such cases as this, you will need to use your professional judgment to determine the appropriate score. At this point, pause the training and work through the practice items in your writing practice booklet with your colleague. Some frequently asked questions regarding the writing domain are on this slide. As with all domains, if you have a question that is not answered here, please look through the Frequently Asked Questions document on the OSPI website. To access the document, please go to OSPI, Assessment, and then ELP Assessment, then Alternate ELP Assessment. If you need further clarification, please submit your question to the ELP Assessment Coordinator. What if the student can't or doesn't write? If you have a student who does not or cannot write, consider how this student typically expresses her or his thoughts. Remember that a student is not required to use a traditional writing utensil for this domain. There may be accommodations available that would help this student access the domain. My student uses an AAC device. How do I incorporate that? If a student uses an AAC device, please look at the accommodations manual for specific guidance. What if the student writes what might be the same letter for all the copy items? If you find that a student is participating, but that participation is limited to a repeated letter or shape, use your professional judgment to determine benefit of the doubt. Generally, we give a benefit of the doubt on the initial item, but then request something more from the next item. As you administer this test, keep in mind that this test is just one piece of data around your student's language development. For valid results, administer the test as objectively as possible. It is best practice to look through the test, especially the writing and speaking sections, ahead of time to ensure you know how they are laid out. Remember that if your student is upset or for any reason would benefit from a break in testing, allow them to take a break, but try to get the testing done within a day or two. This slide provides a quick look at the administration requirements for each domain. If you would like a quick slide to refer to when administering, this slide will remind you when and what to repeat as you administer. This information is also in the TA script as you go through each domain. Please take a moment to complete the post-assessment on the right side of the front page of your handout. Pause the training and we will review the responses when you restart. To review these items, always follow the test script exactly. That is true. The recommended order of testing is listening, reading, writing, speaking. That is false. The recommended order is listening, reading, speaking, writing. However, it is a recommendation, not a required order. If possible, the student should complete each test section or domain in one session. That is true. You must attempt administration of only one task within each domain. That is false. Each domain requires a minimum of 3 tasks before stopping guidance can be applied. Attend includes looking or gazing at a response option, nodding, placing an object on the correct position, and so on. You are looking for evidence that the student is engaged in the test task by paying attention. That is true. You may not cut the answers and paste them on a board, enlarge them, create any combination of supported presentation for the student. That is false. You may cut apart the listening, reading, and speaking test booklet to increase accessibility if needed. You can't stop test administration for that domain unless the student has a no response or incorrect/approaches in 3 consecutive tasks. That is true. It is acceptable to stop the administration of a domain, take a break, and finish the section later. That is also true. Depending on the student's ability to concentrate or medical fragility, you may take more than 1 day for a domain. That is true. However, we do recommend that you try to get the entire testing done within a few days. If you need to stop during speaking and writing, try to stop between the different parts, A, B, and C. That is true. On the listening test, the QA within each task can be repeated more than once. That is false. You can prompt with QA and then repeat only one more time. On the listening and reading tests, you must go through all 3 Qs. That is also false. On the listening and reading test, as with the other tests, once a student answers correctly, you move on to the next task. Mark the incorrect or no response bubbles only after administering all 3 Qs for a task. That is true. Please note, following this training, TAs will need to complete the quiz that is located on the Moodle site and register via Survey Gizmo. You will need the date you took the Moodle quiz and your score to register. OSPI has a number of resources available on our website to support this test administration. Please access these as needed to answer your questions. You can also contact the ELP Assessment Coordinator at the email on your screen. If you are submitting a question specific to the WIDA Alternate Access TA training, please include WIDA training question in your subject line. Thank you for your time and attention during this training. Enjoy your day.